Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're covering the mysterious disappearance of Brandon Swanson. This case is completely insane, especially when you consider the fact that Brandon was on the phone with his parents when he disappeared in 2008, and he's just never been seen since. There is absolutely no evidence in this case, and there are just no good answers as to what could have happened in this case. And you'll see what I mean by no evidence and no good answers being found in this case as we get further into the details. But is it just me, or is it completely baffling to everybody else that someone can just, vanish off of the face of the earth like this? I don't know. Maybe that's just something I think about randomly, that people can just vanish off the face of the earth with absolutely no explanation. But that's what seems to have happened in this case. So this week, I'll cover the case itself and all the head-scratching details that come along with that. And then next week, I'll end up doing probably an entire episode just on theories that people have about this case. And then we can kind of go over those theories and see which ones would work or if they would make sense or not. Because it seems like every single person has a different theory on this case. And a lot of them do make sense and do seem to kind of line up with some of the facts. And after we get done with this case, if you have questions, because there are lots of questions. But if you have questions that you kind of want to talk through, send those over to the email or DM me on social media, and I'll include those questions in next week's episode and kind of talk through those. I think it would be fun, and with all the different theories and possibilities in this case, there's no way that we're going to be able to cover all the theories and questions. But if you have a good question or a good theory, send it over. Now, before I say let's get it, let me shout out April real quick for joining the Patreon family this week. Thank you, girlfriend. I will be sending out stuff before Friday. I'll be reaching out to everyone who joined the Patreon family this week to get the best mailing address for you so I can send over your free goodies. And if you want to join Patreon, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Mama Murdered a Podcast. Or you can just find the Patreon link in the description box of this episode. You can also grab some sweet merch by visiting the merch link in the description under this episode as well. And that's enough of all that, so without further ado, let's get it. Brandon Victor Swanson was born on January 30th in 1989 to his parents Brian and Annette Swanson in Marshall, Minnesota. Brandon also had one younger sister who he was extremely close with, but Brandon was said to be pretty close with all of his family, which you can definitely tell later on. Brandon was also extremely smart. He was the kind of smart where he loved researching different things and was very much into science and nature. Brandon was also an avid reader. He seemed to be the kind of friend that would kind of make you think about things in a different light, and the kind of friend that you could talk to about things that would make you see things through a new perspective that maybe you had never thought of before. Brandon seemed to be liked by everyone who had ever come in contact with him, and if he told you that he would help you with something or that he would be there, you could count on that. And I know that this is something that you hear in a lot of these true crime cases, but I seriously could not find one single bad thing that anyone ever said or had to say about Brandon. Brandon was also legally blind in one eye, which a lot of you may not know this, probably none of you know this, but my niece is actually blind in one eye also. And because of this, sometimes her depth perception is off by a good bit. And other times, distances can kind of get weird. It's a whole thing. Nothing to stop them from doing anything that anyone else could do, just something to keep in mind. Brandon was also extremely close with his parents and his sister, like I mentioned, but he also had plenty of friends that he could count on and call on if he needed. Brandon was 19 years old, and he was attending the Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, Minnesota, where he studied wind turbines, which I did not even realize was a subject that people studied. I mean, I know someone has to study it, but I've never heard of someone studying it, I guess. And this daily drive from his house in Marshall to his school in Canby becomes a super important piece of this case later on, because Brandon should have been super familiar with the drive to and from Marshall to Canby, especially since he lived in Marshall with his parents and went to college in Canby. So this should have been a drive that he would have made pretty frequently, which just makes this case even more confusing. And on May 13th, 2008, classes were over, the semester was over, which means the celebrations were just beginning. A lot of people attending that college had decided to go out on the town, kind of let loose, and they were ready to party. And naturally, Brandon was in that group of people who were going out to blow off some steam. And even though Brandon was going out to kind of paint the town red that night, he took his education and schooling very seriously, and he was extremely responsible. Brandon had gotten all of his credits and was just waiting to be able to transfer to a different four-year college where he had planned to continue getting multiple different college degrees. How many other 19-year-olds do you know that not only want to, but are actually taking the steps to get multiple college degrees? Because I don't know very many. So, Brandon took off from his parents' house where he lived in Marshall, Minnesota at about 6 p.m. on May 13th, 2008, to head out to two different parties. So, he'd left his house in Marshall to head to a nearby town called Lind, Minnesota, which is where the first party was supposed to be. Brandon went to this party in Lind, which wasn't very far from his house in Marshall. And when I say there was a party in Lind, I mean it was more like a low-key, small get-together. Maybe somewhere between 4 and 8 people at most. And once Brandon arrived at this party in Lind, he hung out for a while, he chatted with friends, and was reportedly seen in the same glasses that he wore every day. He also had on a silver chain-link necklace, he also had both ears pierced, and Brandon's outfit of the night consisted of a blue polo shirt with stripes, a dark sweater type of shirt over his blue polo shirt that's kind of the sweater zipped up. He was also wearing baggy blue jeans and a white Minnesota Twins baseball hat, which was his favorite team. And if you're anything like me, I can see this outfit in my head, and it is all very much 2008 feeling. Brandon was for sure drinking at the party in Lind, but no one was really paying attention to how much he drank. Everyone at the first party in Lind that Brandon attended said that he was acting completely normal, and that they didn't notice anything out of the normal. Brandon was drinking, but he hadn't drank so much that his friends felt the need to hide his car keys or make him stay overnight and sleep it off or anything like that either. Because Brandon did leave this party in Lind at about 10:30 p.m. and he was headed to the next party in Canby. Now, the next party in Canby, I couldn't find how many people were there, or if this was like a real party with more people, or if it was like the first party in Lind that he had been at with just a few friends. Canby isn't too far from Lind, where Brandon had been at the first party that he attended, but if my Google Map search is right, Marshall, Minnesota is somewhere in the middle of Lind and Canby. But from Lind, where the first party was, to Canby, where the second party was, those two locations are in the opposite directions from one another. And it would have been about 30-something miles or 40-something minutes from Lind to Canby, where the first party was to where he was going to the second party. And it looks like you would have to go back through Marshall, where Brandon lived with his parents, in order to get from Lind, where the first party was, to get to Canby, where the second party was, that he was going to. I could be wrong about that, but I did look it up over and over and over again, and that's approximately a rough guesstimation from what I could see. I should also note that I'm terrible with directions, but let's continue. Since the first party was in Lind, and Lind is about 10 minutes from Brandon's parents' house in Marshall where he lived, and the second party in Canby was the opposite direction of Lind, the second party in Canby is also where the technical college that Brandon attended was located. Now, Brandon did make it to the second party in Canby. He stayed and he hung out at the party with his friends and some people from school. And again, people that were at this second party in Canby with Brandon all said that he was acting completely normal and that he did not seem too drunk to drive, he wasn't slurring his words, and he wasn't delayed. We also have to keep in mind that this is a bunch of 19-year-olds and probably not the best judgment of who's had too much to drink. So, Brandon headed out to leave this party in Canby at about midnight, which brings us over to the next morning technically. So, once Brandon left the party in Canby at midnight, it was technically May 14th, 2008. People who were at this second party with Brandon also said that he did have some drinks at the second party, but again, he wasn't too drunk to drive. So, it doesn't seem like Brandon was hammered to the point where his friends felt like he wouldn't be able to make the drive home safely, which makes me think that Brandon probably didn't have all that much to drink since he knew he would have to drive himself home. So this kind of makes it hard to gauge Brandon's level of drunkenness, if you will. Just because no one at the first party said that Brandon drank to excess and no one at the second party said that he drank to excess, they also weren't counting each other's drinks, and obviously Brandon wasn't throwing back shots either. But most people at the second party in Canby did agree that Brandon did have at least one shot, So the general consensus is that Brandon did drink at both parties. We're just not exactly sure how much he drank or if he was too drunk to drive. And again, his level of drunkenness, if you will, ends up coming back up later, so just keep all this in mind. And from everything I could find, Brandon had, at 19, already gotten a DUI, even though he wasn't 21 and he wasn't of legal drinking age yet. And he was still on a probationary period with the courts about this DUI. So my thinking with this is that he was probably super cautious about how much he did have to drink because, he had already gotten this DUI. He probably got in trouble with his parents. He for sure got in trouble with the courts. So he was probably, on it about how much he drank since he knew he would have to drive himself home. From what I could find, this DUI happened 2 years prior to 2008, so he was probably about 17, which I feel like is a completely normal thing for 17 to 20-year-olds to do, is to drink too much and drive. Sad but true. Now, Brandon left this second party in Canby by himself, and everyone kind of agrees that it was about midnight, like I mentioned. And Highway 68 is the one road that I saw that Brandon would have probably taken home. It would have been a straight shot from the second party in Canby to Brandon's parents' house where he lived in Marshall. It literally would have been a straight drive. He would have probably turned off onto his driveway, and that would have been it. On this route home on Highway 68, somehow Brandon had lost control of his car and had veered off into the ditch. Brandon tried calling a few different friends for help, but it was after 1 a.m., and he was probably trying to call everyone besides his parents for help, especially since he had already gotten and been dealing with the DUI. Now he had to call his parents after he'd been drinking that night again and driving again. And now, after he'd already been in trouble with the law for drinking and driving again, but after none of his friends answered, Brandon kind of sucked it up and just called home. He was probably thinking that his parents would at least come and get him, and he'd deal with their lectures and consequences about this later. Brandon's green Chevy Lumina sedan was in a ditch in a way where he wouldn't have just been able to back the car up or get it out by himself. And there's a lot of pictures online, and I'm not sure which one is the right picture, but I'll post the picture that is most commonly used in association with this case. It kind of just looks like he bottomed out, like his tires weren't touching the ground, so you're not really going anywhere if the bottom of your car is touching dirt, but your tires aren't. So after trying a few friends and getting no answer, Brandon finally broke down and called his parents at 1:54 a.m. to tell them about the car being in the ditch. Now, Brandon made sure to tell his parents firstly that he was fine, he wasn't harmed or hurt in any way, that he just wasn't able to get the car out by himself. Brandon's parents got dressed and left to find their son immediately after he called. Brandon had even given his parents the directions to where his car was stuck in the ditch at. So they headed out to find him with the directions that Brandon had given them. Brandon had even told his parents that he was only about 10 minutes or so from home, somewhere in between Marshall, where he lived, and Lind, where the first party had been at. Brandon's parents say that during this call that Brandon wasn't panicked or frenzied, but that he was calm and just kind of explaining what had happened and trying to just, tell them where they could come and find him to pick him up. So this is where Brandon tells his parents that he is, and this is one of the first things in this case that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Because Brandon had gone to the party in Lind first and then gone in the opposite direction to Canby to the second party. So if the second party was in Canby and that's where he'd been heading home from, then why would he even be in Lind to begin with again? Like I said, for him to have been in between Marshall and Lind, like he said, he would have already passed through Marshall, which is where he was headed, because Marshall is where he lived. So I know this is a little bit confusing. I will post a map. I promise. Did he go back to Lind for something? For some reason that we don't know about? Why did he think he was in Lind if you have to pass Marshall and he was going home and Marshall is where he lived? That doesn't make sense. And I've looked at these roads until it has given me a headache. And the only other ways that I see for Brandon to be in between Lind and Marshall would have been back roads that would have taken him way, way, way out of the way in the most direct route home. Because if we're looking at this like a piece of paper, reading from left to right, it would be Canby, Marshall, and then Lind. So it makes no sense for him to have been leaving Canby, headed to Marshall, and then think he ended up in Lind when he called his parents. Something else to take note of with this call to his parents is that the drive from Canby to Marshall should have taken Brandon anywhere from 40 to 50 minutes, depending on how fast he was going, if there were any stoplights that caught him, if there was any traffic or not, etc., etc. And then we have to keep in mind the fact that Brandon drove this route daily for his college classes. His college was in Canby also, and he lived in Marshall still. So this should have been a very normal drive back and forth for him. Either way, it really shouldn't have taken Brandon more than about 50 minutes to get home. And Brandon left this party in Canby at about midnight, but he didn't call his parents until about 1:54 a.m. That's almost 2 hours. What happened to make this route that Brandon drove nearly every day to get to and from college that should have taken 50 minutes take more than an hour and 54 minutes? So let's jump back to the timeline. So Brandon's parents are on his way to make this 10-minute drive to where they believe Brandon is, and once they get to the spot that Brandon had told them that his car was in the ditch at near Lind, they don't see Brandon or his car anywhere. Brandon had told his parents that he was on the left side of the road from the way that they would have been coming to pick him up from, that he was near a gravel road about 10 minutes down Highway 23. And again, let me try to explain this because I suck at giving and following directions. But to get from Lind to Marshall, it should have been a straight shot. And then from Marshall to Canby would have also been a straight shot. So in order to get to all three of these different towns, it would have all been a straight shot down Highway 68. There's really no reason for him to even be on Highway 23 like he thought he was. And Highway 23 would have been the opposite direction of where he should have been. But Brandon's parents also didn't know where he had been that night. They knew that he was going out, but they didn't know each and every single stop that he planned to make. So they had no way of knowing which direction he should have been or where he would have been coming from to know where to look. Brandon's parents had even stayed on the phone with him while they were driving this route to try to find him. They still weren't having any luck, though. They still don't see Brandon or his car anywhere. And again, where Brandon had explained that he was to his parents, this would have been one road they would have had to have driven down to find him, which would have been Highway 68. And this is where Brandon starts to get frustrated. He even hung up on his parents at one point because he's telling them, like, I'm right here. I don't know how you don't see me or why you can't find me. And his parents are like, we are literally right here where you said you were and we don't see you. Brandon had even told his dad, Brian, at one point during one of these phone calls throughout the night that he was, quote, absolutely positive that he knew where he was. There was another point during the call where they're both trying to find each other and Brandon's parents start flashing their headlights on their car and honking their car horn, just hoping that Brandon would either see the headlights flashing or hear the honking of the horn, but he doesn't hear or see anything. So Brandon's parents ask Brandon to flash his lights and honk his horn. And his parents even claimed that they could hear the clicking from Brandon's lights being turned off and on over the phone with him. They still weren't seeing his headlights anywhere or hearing him blow his horn from anywhere. And what we later find out is that Brandon wasn't actually anywhere near where he thought he was. And I'm only saying this now because I'll go over this more in detail once we get to that point in the timeline. But Brandon was actually 20 miles away from where he thought he was and where he gave his parents direction to find him. And the only reason that I can think of that Brandon would have taken this route, which would have taken almost double the time, would be that Brandon was actively trying to avoid any major highways and roads where police checkpoints or stops may have been set up. And that's really the only reason that I can think of as to why Brandon would have taken this route to begin with, because this route would have been a lot of back roads and a lot of extra turns and a lot of extra roads to take in general to get home. Because if he would have taken his usual route and the route that was a straight shot that he took every day to get to college, he would have probably had a better understanding as to where he was. But the thing about that is that Brandon didn't seem confused about where he was. That's the wildest part. He was actually getting pretty annoyed and pissed at his parents because he thought he knew exactly where he was. He was sure that he knew exactly where he was, and he's getting annoyed and is pissed at his parents because, he told them exactly where to go, and they aren't just pulling up to take him home because they don't see him. And Brandon and his parents were on the phone with each other the entire time that they were trying to find each other. Brandon is still getting pissed that they can't find him. And his parents are getting annoyed that he swears he knows where he is, but they're in that exact spot that he said that he was, and they just don't see him anywhere. Something else that probably wasn't helping the situation is that it was kind of cold that night. It was like 40 degrees, and Brandon had been at school all day and then out for a good portion of the night. His parents had just woken up out of bed to come and look for him, and now they can't find each other anyways. So I can see why everyone is kind of annoyed, aggravated, pissed off, and frustrated. So Brandon comes up with a different idea. He says that he can see the lights from the town of Lind and that he's just going to meet them at a very specific spot. That way no one was confused and no one would have the problem with the directions, and then they could just all go home. So since Brandon says that he can see the lights from the town of Lind, he tells his parents that he's just going to walk and meet them at this very specific spot, and they all agreed to meet at this bar, which was called the Linwood and Trev's Tavern. And Brandon told his parents that it would probably take him about 10 minutes to walk to the parking lot of this bar, and then the confusion would be cleared up and everyone would be able to go home and get some rest. So this was Brandon's solution to everyone not being able to get confused or mixed up about where they were supposed to be and the directions and what have you. This is the only reason that they all agreed to let Brandon walk to this one specific spot instead of everyone riding around and walking down these back roads trying to find one another. Now, this next part, it's a little confusing because there's different reports. But it says that since Brandon's parents knew that it was going to take him at least 10 minutes to walk to the bar and grill, and, now they were all cleared up about where they were going to be meeting up at, that Brandon's dad, Brian, had decided to take Brandon's mom, Annette, home. There are other reports, and Annette herself has said that that's not the case. She was with her husband all night, and that they were both on the phone with Brandon. Either way, regardless, the entire time, Brandon has been on the phone with his mom or dad the whole time. Now, while Brandon is walking to this tavern to meet up with his parents, he's describing what he sees and hears while he's walking to the bar and grill to meet up with them. Brandon tells his dad that he's gonna get off the main road and just cut through one of the fields because he thought it would be quicker to cut through the field than it would be to walk on the main road to get to the bar and grill. And sometime after this, Brandon tells his dad, Brian, that he can hear running water. And this would have been obviously after he had already cut through one of the fields to try to shave off some time from the walk. And Brandon's still describing different things to his dad. He tells his dad he's having to go over another fence line. So it seems like he's had to go through multiple different fence lines, which is weird. And the call continues like this with Brandon describing different things to his parents until they just hear Brandon yell, "Oh shit." And then Brian says that he heard what sounded like a fall or some kind of rustling sort of noise. The call doesn't disconnect though. Brandon's parents are still yelling for Brandon to answer the phone, hoping maybe he would hear it. If he did fall, maybe he would hear them yelling and, that would be able to lead him back to where he dropped his phone. But those words would be the last words that his parents ever heard their son say were, "Oh shit." Brandon stopped responding to his parents, and I've seen a lot of places that after Brandon said, "Oh shit," and after his dad heard whatever noise he heard, that the call disconnected at 3:10 a.m. But Brandon's mom would later clarify this, and she said that Brandon's dad, Brian, had actually been the one to disconnect the call just to be able to try to call Brandon back, but they had no luck. Brian tried calling Brandon's cell phone another 5 or 6 times with no answer, and the phone was going straight to voicemail. And his parents have said that they were hoping that maybe the sound or the light from the phone where they were calling would either alert Brandon that the call had been disconnected, or that possibly if he had fallen or maybe hit his head, that the light or the sound or the ringing from the phone would kind of make him come to. But every time that Brian or Annette tried to call Brandon after that, the phone would ring a few times and then go straight to voicemail. And I know for me, 2008 seems like just a few years ago, but it's actually been over 15 years. So you have to think about how much phones have changed in 15 years. We have much better signal tracking, and triangulation has gotten a lot better over the last 15 years. I couldn't find anywhere that said the context of the way that Brandon said, "Oh shit," because I'm going to give you some examples and what I think they would mean, because there are so many different variations of the way I could say "oh shit" that could mean so many different things. And this has never been clarified. So for instance, if I just fell down, I'm going to say "oh shit." if I, bumped into somebody that I didn't see or notice there before, I'm going to say, oh, shit. Like, oh, shit, you scared me. There are so many ways that you can think of to say that they could mean so many different things. And I've never seen it clarified as to how it was said. Did it sound like he fell? Did it sound like he stumbled across something that he hadn't noticed before, didn't realize was there? There are so many ways I feel like this could be interpreted as to how it meant. Another thing to remember is that the battery life of a phone in 2008 wasn't what it is now with the newest iPhones or Androids, whatever there are out now. A lot of people have assumed in this case that if the phone was still ringing, that it must have still been on and active. That's just not how cell phones worked in 2008. It's been said by specialists and experts that the phone model of the phone that Brandon would have been carrying would have still rang, even if the phone was submerged underwater or if the phone was dead. So we've all learned already through the years that 2008 to 2011 phones were built different. And it was 2008, so of course that's the kind of cell phone that Brandon had. So whoever would have been making the call would have heard the ringing noise, but the person on the other end of the phone may not have heard, anything. And this is another thing that I wonder. Brandon had been on the phone with his parents for, I think, 47 minutes while they were trying to find each other. What if his phone notified him while he was on it, and maybe his parents didn't hear this notification that, you have 3% battery life left? Okay, I could see him pulling the phone away from his ear, glancing down at his phone, saying, oh, shit, and then the phone dies. So maybe it's not even anything nefarious. Maybe it's something as simple as his phone notified him that it was dying. His parents wouldn't have heard the notification. We just don't have any clarification. This part drives me insane. Brandon's parents searched the road that Brandon had initially told him that his car was stuck in the ditch on, and also the road that the bar and grill was on, where they were supposed to be meeting Brandon at when he took off walking. And there was no trace or even so much as a sign of Brandon anywhere in the vicinity. His parents had kind of assumed that Brandon had fallen at first, but the more they searched, the less likely that option became. And now is about the time that his parents started to worry more, because now they're starting to worry that there may be something more wrong than just Brandon's car being stuck in a ditch. And they started frantically calling all of Brandon's friends to see if maybe anybody had heard from him recently, but none of them had. After calling a lot of Brandon's friends, and after realizing that none of them had heard from Brandon either, all of Brandon's friends met up with Brian and Annette to help search the roads for Brandon. They all figured that he had to be out there somewhere, and they were all hell-bent on finding him. So Brian, Annette, and a group of Brandon's friends all came together to search for Brandon through the rest of the early morning hours, with absolutely no trace of him anywhere to be found, which is weird because a car is a pretty big thing to overlook. It wasn't like they just couldn't find Brandon. They still hadn't even been able to find his car. And eventually at 6:30 a.m. on May 14th, 2008, on the same day that Brandon had ran his car off into the ditch and called his parents for help, Brandon's parents went to the Lyon County Police Department to officially report Brandon as a missing person. So they didn't even call. They went straight to the police department to file a missing persons report. And of course, the police weren't really concerned initially. They basically told Annette and Brian to calm down, that Brandon was an adult, that he had the right to go missing since he was 19 years old. Yes, a legitimate police officer told parents that were worried sick that their 19-year-old son had the right to go missing. But if Brandon were trying to go missing, he wouldn't have called his parents to come and pick him up. He wouldn't have stayed on the phone with his parents for almost an hour while they tried to find each other. And he wouldn't have given them his exact location to where he believed that he was. That don't even make no damn sense. The last thing that Brandon said to his parents was, oh shit, that doesn't sound like someone who doesn't want to be found or someone who's taking off to start a new life. It actually took Brian and Annette hours to convince the police to take Brandon's disappearance seriously. And I will never understand this. At the very least, just send some officers out to look through the area in question. If nothing else, you find a kid alive. You're the hometown hero. And if you find nothing during those searches, then at the very least, you were patrolling the area in question, which is your whole last job to begin with. So I don't know what kind of hell Brandon's parents raised to get someone in law enforcement to take them seriously, but they eventually did. So police, friends, and Brian and Annette were all out and had searched every nook and cranny of Lind and still found absolutely no sign of Brandon. Which tells me that Brandon thought he was in Lind, but that he was actually somewhere else. Once police decided to actually do their job and pulled cell phone records, law enforcement was able to see that Brandon's cell phone was actually pretty far away from Lind. So even though Brandon had been telling both of his parents all night that his car was in a ditch in Lind, once police recovered Brandon's cell phone data, his cell phone records show that his car was near Taunton, Minnesota, which was about 12 or 13 miles away from Canby, where Brandon had been leaving the second party and heading home from. So approximately a 15-minute drive. And if Brandon left the party in Canby at midnight and was actually in Taunton instead of Lind like he thought, and if that drive was only supposed to take 15 minutes at most, then what happened for it to take almost 2 hours for Brandon to get where he was in Taunton and call his parents, when it should have only taken 15 minutes? These are the theories we'll get into next week, but let's keep going. Brandon's cell phone actually pinged near Taunton during the first part of the call with his parents, and then later on during the call, it pinged near Minneota, which is another town nearby. So hear me out. Taunton and Minneota would have still been on the same route that he would have taken home from Canby to Lind. So it's not far-fetched to think that Brandon was telling his parents that he could see the lights from Lind, that it was more likely that he was actually seeing the lights from either the town of Taunton or the town of Minneota. But Brandon was saying that it would only take him about 10 minutes to walk there to the bar and grill to meet his parents, but he had actually been walking for almost an hour. So none of these time frames match up. Brandon left the party in Canby at midnight, but didn't make the call to his parents about his car until almost 2 hours later. So I don't know what happened during those 2 hours, and we still don't know. Like I said, there are plenty of theories, but no one knows for sure. But what we do know is that something had to happen to make that drive that should have taken 15 minutes take close to 2 hours. So not only are none of the timelines matching up, but none of the locations are matching up either. We also have to keep in mind that Brandon was probably fatigued. He had been drinking at least a little bit that we know of, and that he was blind in one eye. Because even though Brandon swore he was in the town of Lind, his phone last pinged near Taunton, which was about 20 miles away from Lind. So all the lights that Brandon thought he saw that were from the town of Lind were actually from Taunton. And police had already wasted more time than they should have by not taking Brandon's disappearance seriously to begin with. Did y'all know there is actually an entire show about how important the first 48 hours of a missing persons or murder case is? And yet the police had to be convinced by Brandon's parents to take his disappearance seriously, which is absolutely ridiculous. Now, the town of Taunton and the town of Minneota have a lot more fields and fences, which would have made more sense with what Brandon was describing to his parents. And the Yellow Medicine River runs right through both of these two towns also, so this is likely where Brandon was, like his phone pings were indicating. And this would explain why Brandon thought that cutting through the fields and hopping fences would get him to the town, that he was mistaken for Lind faster. It would also explain Brandon saying that he could hear running water nearby, because the Yellow Medicine River would have been close by to where Brandon's phone was actually pinging at in Taunton. So now that police at least knew that Brandon's phone had pinged near Taunton during the first part of the call that he made to his parents, which the phone call ended up lasting about 47 minutes anyways, but now at least the police and Brandon's parents and friends had a starting point for their searches, and they started searching through the town of Taunton. And it was during the search of the town of Taunton that was head started at about 12 p.m. that Brandon's Chevy Lumina was found at 12:30 p.m. on May 14th, 2008. And Brandon's car was actually found near a gravel road, just like Brandon had been describing to his parents during their almost hour-long phone call. Brandon's car was also in a ditch, just like he described to his parents, but somehow Brandon had gone off of the main highway that would have gotten him home, which was Highway 68. The car was not found on Highway 68. It was found on another road called Lyon-Lincoln County Road, nearby the towns of Taunton and Minneota. The place that Brandon's car was found doesn't make a whole lot of sense still, though, because he should have been on the most direct route, which would have been Highway 68, but he wasn't. And Brandon had grown up in Minnesota, so I'm not really sure why or how he got so confused and turned around on these roads that he'd been riding on his entire life. But he did, and he ended up in a ditch in between two towns nearby a gravel road. But looking at the roads in Minnesota, because I looked an awful lot at Google Maps during this case, and it's a lot of flat land with street names that are basically just numbers. So it really wouldn't be the weirdest thing I've ever heard of for someone to get lost, especially in the dark and especially on these kinds of roads. Even someone who's familiar with the area, from what I found online and looking at these roads, I'd never make it. So I don't know. Brandon's parents are still adamant that Brandon knew these roads and that he knew his way around. Now, once Brandon's car was found, there was no sign of any injury or struggle. There was no blood and nothing was like torn apart or trashed. The keys were not inside of Brandon's car, and the keys have still never been found to this day. Brandon's car was found about 20 to 25 minutes away from the spot that he had been describing to his parents. So Brandon was 25 minutes away from where he thought he was, which would explain exactly why his parents couldn't find him. Because he wasn't in the location that he thought he was, which was where he was telling his parents to pick him up at, when in all reality, he was 25 minutes up the road. And this doesn't make any sense at all. This is the part where everyone who's ever looked into this case starts getting even more confused. Brandon kept telling his parents that he was in Lind that night when he called to have his parents come and get him, which we know that he wasn't there, but even so, forget about that for a minute. And think about how I've described this route. Canby is where Brandon was coming from, headed home to Marshall where he lived. But in order for Brandon to even believe that he was in Lind, he would have had to have drove through or at least past Marshall, which is where he was headed home to. So why did he believe that he was in Lind to begin with? And then his car's found 25 minutes away in Minnesota. None of it adds up. Brandon would have had to have passed his town of Marshall where he lived in order to get to Lind where he thought he was. It doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense. I will say, if Brandon was on the phone with someone, or even if he was having like a solo concert in his car by himself, like rocking out, he could have easily taken a wrong turn and ended up lost just by not really paying attention. I've done that 100 times before, and if he had taken a wrong turn, or even a few wrong turns, he could have easily gotten lost and not even realized that he was lost. And Brandon would have known how long it would take for him to drive from Canby to Lind, which is probably why he assumed that he was in Lind when he called his parents. That part at least makes sense to me, but let's continue. Now, the only weird thing that was found inside of Brandon's car was the fact that Brandon's glasses were found inside, which is something that Brandon would have had at all times, especially driving that late at night and under the influence of some kind of alcohol, because he was legally blind in one eye. So that's weird. And I don't see anything that says that Brandon's glasses were broken, but then that just makes me kind of wonder if he was driving without glasses, or even if that's possibly why he'd gotten so turned around and lost in the first place. The next weird thing, which I'll explain in a second, is that either a car door was left open, or a few car doors were left open, or the car was unlocked. There's nothing that clarifies how the doors were left, quote-unquote, opened. The missing person flyer that was handed out and posted everywhere to be on the lookout for Brandon simply says about the doors being left open, quote, his car was found abandoned in a ditch with the doors opened and the keys missing. That's all it says. So does that mean that all four of the car doors were like open and ajar? Or does that mean that just the driver door was open and ajar? Or does this just mean that all of Brandon's car doors were unlocked? This part raises a lot of questions for me too, because just the doors being unlocked and being left wide open are two very different things to me. There were no footprints to indicate which way Brandon had taken off walking, and we'd later find out that no footprints were able to be found because the road that Brandon's car had been found on had been graded earlier that morning. And grading a road is just where the state sends a crew of people out to come through with this huge machine to level back out dirt roads or gravel roads. So the road being graded would have destroyed any usable footprints in the gravel or the grass surrounding the areas where Brandon's car was found. So it would be impossible to see any footprints to be able to know which way he took off walking. I found a quote about the way that Brandon's car was found, and I found this quote on thecrimewire.com, and it says, quote, "The vehicle simply looked like it was stuck in a ditch or partially in the ditch. There was nothing odd about it. If a person passed by, they would think it was just parked there or broken down and stuck." So now with the discovery of Brandon's car, police are, of course, starting to expand the search efforts because they're probably kind of thinking, well, if his car was found here, then he can't be too far away, especially if he took off on foot. And with that, the search for Brandon Swanson began. And investigators pulled out all the stops. They brought out four-wheelers, helicopters, and they even had 5 different people flying overhead with powered parachutes. I'm not even sure what that is. They also brought in scent dogs, which brings me to my next point. The scent dogs that were brought out, they actually did pick up and track Brandon's scent, and they tracked his scent for 3 whole ass miles into fields and then an old abandoned farmhouse, and then the dogs headed toward the Yellow Medicine River. They indicated to their handler that Brandon had been in the water. But that could mean a few different things, like Brandon could have walked through the river thinking that it would have been a shorter walk to meet up with his parents at the tavern, or it could mean that he tripped and fell into the water and then maybe was like, oh shit, and that's what his parents last heard. But then maybe Brandon was able to get back out of the water if he'd just fallen. Another option is even that maybe Brandon had been in the water just to cross over to the other side of the river, thinking that maybe it would be a faster route again. He could have just as easily been in that river for another reason that could be a more nefarious reason, but we don't know, and we'll wait till next week to go over all the different theories of why he may have been in the water, the way he said, oh shit, all of that. But only some of those theories and options really make sense because the dogs picked up Brandon's scent going into the river, but then they also picked up his scent coming back out of the river. So there are many, many, many theories about this body of water and what could have happened, and we'll get into those next week, like I said. So with Brandon's scent being found in and then back out of the river, the Yellow Medicine River was searched and nothing at all was found. There was no body found in the search of the river. There was not one single piece of evidence to point to Brandon drowning in the water. Not one single piece of evidence that was found during the search of the river at all. And investigators believe that there is no way that Brandon was in the river and not alive because they believe that after all this time, that Brandon's body would have washed back up onto shore by now. Which would make sense, especially since Brandon's scent had been picked up going into the water and then coming back out. So I agree with that. I agree that Brandon probably isn't in the river that they were searching, and it's been searched many, many times since 2008 with still nothing being found. It's also not a very big river, and like I've said, they've searched this river for years, and they've searched the surrounding areas for years, and there's nothing found. There's never been anything found. But back to the first few days of the search efforts. Cadaver dogs were brought in after this search of the river, and the cadaver dogs did alert to the scent of human remains near Mud Creek. But after searchers searched the area, nothing of note was ever found where the human remains scent was detected near Mud Creek either. This is what I mean when I said earlier that there's really nothing evidence-worthy that's ever been found. After cadaver dogs picked up the scent of human remains near Mud Creek, law enforcement, family, and friends and volunteers all searched that area and even the surrounding areas on foot in 15 to 20 foot increments at a time. And it seems like the dogs would pick up a scent and then lose the scent shortly after, pick it up somewhere else and then lose it again shortly after. And this kind of ends up being a running theme in this case. Law enforcement, Brandon's friends and family, and even volunteers searched like this tirelessly for a solid week with four-wheelers, helicopters, tracking dogs, cadaver dogs. And during this entire week of searching, absolutely nothing was found. After the first week, the official and organized search efforts came to a stop, though Brandon's family and friends kept at it on their own without the help of professionals. Brandon's family continued to search all summer, and more official and organized searches started back in the fall months. So now investigators are back on the search for Brandon. The water levels have dropped. The crops weren't in the way. The area wasn't saturated with mud and standing water like it had been before when they were searching. The cadaver dogs were brought out again, and again the cadaver dogs picked up the scent, and they would lose it shortly after. And I didn't realize this until a few years ago when I got really big into deep diving cases, that the wind can actually move scent pools around to different areas than where they were to begin with. So, like, the wind can legit move a scent pool from one spot to another, which just makes it so much harder in a case like this. And the searches continued like this for right at 2 years, which just meant that for those entire 2 years worth of searches, any evidence that was possibly in the area has probably been tampered with or moved or even destroyed. They were bringing in different dogs from all over, and searches stopped in certain seasons of the year and would pick back up in other seasons. More than 120 square miles was searched and combed through and covered during these seasonal searches, and nothing at all was found. Not one single thing to point to any evidence as to where Brandon may be or what had possibly happened to him. And then in 2010, the case was handed over to the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Investigation in hopes that possibly a fresh set of eyes and ideas would lead to more information in this case. More searches were done and continued to be done throughout the years. The search efforts have continued since 2008 when Brandon went missing, and even after 2010 when the case changed hands and was handed over to the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Investigation. And still to this day in 2023, not one single piece of evidence has been found. Not any of Brandon's personal belongings like his cell phone, his clothes, shoes, jewelry, or even his car keys. Nothing at all has been found. And there's still so much farmland that still hasn't been searched for a variety of different reasons. Either the farmer's crops were in the middle of growing and, police didn't want to tamper with crops, I guess. I don't understand that part about this case. There's a lot of places that weren't searched because of, crops growing. We're talking about a whole ass human here. You got a whole nother year to do farming. Them crops will grow back. Anyways, I'm getting off track. And then there are even some farmers that have completely refused to let investigators search their farmland. And this just raises more questions for me. Like, why would you say, no, you can't search my farm for a missing 19-year-old young man? And we'll get into all those theories, and we'll have to wait and do that next week, because that's literally all of the information available on the mysterious disappearance of Brandon Swanson. Aside from the theories and the questions, there's so many questions. When Brandon was reported missing, he had brown hair and blue eyes, and approximately 5 foot 6 inches tall, and he weighed in at about 120 pounds. Next week, we'll go over the theories that have surrounded this case, and if you have questions now after hearing this case, either DM me on social media on any of my accounts, or send it to mamamurderedapodcast@gmail.com, and we'll go over all of those questions and theories next week. And I get that this case is so frustrating just because his parents were literally on the phone with Brandon when he went missing. He had seeked out the help of his parents and was actively trying to find them. But then investigators go search the area where we now know that he was because of not only where his phone was pinging, but also where his car was found. And then investigators search and search and search for years and years and years, and they just find absolutely nothing? How? And they didn't just not find Brandon. They have found absolutely no evidence. Nothing to show where he was headed, nothing to show what possibly happened to him, nothing to show where he may be today. So if y'all have your own theories or your own questions, send them my way and we'll talk about all these things next week. And thank y'all so much. We just hit 25,000 downloads, which is amazing. Thank you for always being so supportive. If you want some sweet merch, you can do that in the link below. If you want to become a member of the Patreon family, you can also do that by finding the link below. Y'all don't forget to follow me on social media. On TikTok, it's Mama Murdered a Podcast. You can also find me on Facebook using Mama Murdered a Podcast. On Instagram and Twitter, it'll be under murdered_mama. And with all of that being said, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.